This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. We return now to MIT professor Noam Chomsky speaking at the event.
The U.S. isolation at Marrakesh is symptomatic of broader developments that we should think about pretty carefully. They're of considerable significance. U.S. isolation in the world is increasing in remarkable ways. Maybe the most striking is right in this hemisphere, what used to be called our little region over here. Henry Stimson, Secretary of War under Roosevelt. Our little region over here where nobody bothers us. If anybody gets out of line, we punish them harshly. Otherwise, they do what we say. That's very far from true. During this century, Latin America, for the first time in 500 years, has freed itself from Western imperialism. Last century, that's the United States. The International Monetary Fund, which is basically an agency of the U.S. Treasury, has been kicked out of South America entirely. There are no U.S. military bases left. The international organizations, the hemispheric organizations are beginning to exclude the United States and Canada. In 2015, there was a summit coming up, and the United States might have been excluded completely from the hemisphere over the issue of Cuba. That was the crucial issue that the hemisphere, on which the hemisphere opposed U.S. policy, as does the world. That's surely the reason why Obama made the gestures towards normalization that were at least some step forward and could be reversed under Trump. We don't know. On a much more far-reaching scale, something similar is happening in Asia. As you know, one of Obama's major policies was the so-called pivot to Asia, which was actually a measure to confront China transparently. One component of the pivot to Asia was the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which excluded China, tried to bring in other Asia-Pacific countries. Well, that seems to be on its way to collapse for pretty good reasons, I think. But at the same time, there's another international trade agreement that is expanding and growing, namely China's region, what they call their Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is now drawing in U.S. allies from Peru to Australia to Japan. The U.S. will probably choose to stay out of it, just as the United States virtually alone has stayed away from China's Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, a kind of counterpart to the World Bank that the U.S. has opposed for many years, but has now been joined by practically all U.S. allies, Britain and others. That's at the same time, China is expanding to the West with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the China-based Silk Roads. The whole system is an integrated system of energy, resource sharing, and so on. It includes Siberia with its rich resources. It includes India and Pakistan. Iran will soon join, it appears, and probably Turkey. This will extend all the way from China to Europe. The United States has asked for observer status, and it's been rejected, not permitted. One of the major commitments of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the whole of the Central Asian states, is that there can be no U.S. military bases in this entire region. Another step towards isolation may soon take place if the president-elect carries through his promise to terminate the nuclear weapons, the nuclear deal with Iran. Other countries who are parties to the deal might well continue. They might even ignore Europe mainly. That means ignoring U.S. sanctions. That will extend U.S. isolation even from Europe. And in fact, Europe might move under these circumstances towards backing off from the confrontation with Russia. Actually, Brexit may assist with this because Britain was the voice of the United States in NATO, the harshest voice. Now it's out, gives Europe some opportunities. There were choices in 1990-91, time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev had what he called a vision of a common European home, an integrated cooperative system of security, commerce, interchange, no military alliances from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The U.S. insisted on a different vision, namely Soviet Union collapses and NATO remains and indeed expands right up to the borders of Russia now, where very serious threats are evident daily. Well, all of these are significant developments. They're related to the widely discussed matter of decline of American power. There are some conventional measures which, however, are misleading in quite interesting ways. I'll just say a word about it, because there's no time, but it's something to seriously think about. By conventional measures, in 1945, the United States had reached the peak of global dominance, nothing like it in history. It had perhaps 50% of total world's wealth. Other industrial countries were devastated or destroyed by the war, severely damaged. The U.S. economy had gained enormously from the war, and the U.S. in general had a position of dominance with no historical parallel. Well, that, of course, couldn't last. Other industrial countries reconstructed. By around 1970, the world was described as tripolar, three major economic centers, German-based Europe, US-based North America, and the Northeast Asian area, at that time Japan-based. Now China has moved in as a partner, conflict and partner. By that time, U.S. share in global wealth was about 25%, and today it's not far below that. Well, all of this is highly misleading because it fails to take into account a crucial factor which is almost never discussed, though there's some interesting work on it. That's the question of ownership of the world economy. If you take a look at the multinational corporations around the world, what do they own? Well, that turns out to be a pretty interesting matter. In virtually every, this increasingly during the period of neoliberal globalization of the last generation, corporate wealth is becoming a more realistic measure of global power than national wealth. Corporate wealth, of course, is nationally based, supported by taxpayers like us, but the ownership has nothing to do with us. Corporate ownership, if you look at that, it turns out that in virtually every economic sector, manufacturing, finance, services, retail, and others, U.S. corporations are well in the lead in ownership of the global economy. And overall, their ownership is close to 50% of the total. That's roughly the proportion of U.S. national wealth in 1945, which tells you something about the nature of the world in which we live. Of course, that's not for the benefit of American citizens, but of those who own and manage these private, publicly supported private quasi-totalitarian systems. If you look at the military dimension, of course, the U.S. is supreme. Nobody's even close. No point talking about it. But it is possible that Europe might take a more independent role. It might move towards something like Gorbachev's vision that might lead to a relaxation of the rising and very dangerous tensions at the Russian border, which would be a very welcome development. Well, there's a lot more to say about the fears and hopes and prospects. The threats and dangers are very real. There are plenty of opportunities. And as we face them, again, particularly the younger people among you, we should never overlook the fact that the threats that we now face are the most severe that have ever arisen in human history. They are literal threats to survival, nuclear war, environmental catastrophe. These are very urgent concerns. They cannot be delayed. They became more urgent on November 8th for the reasons you know and that I mentioned. They have to be faced directly and soon if the human experiment is not to prove to be a disastrous failure.
MIT professor Noam Chomsky, world-renowned linguist and political dissident, speaking Monday night at Riverside Church as part of a celebration marking 20 years of Democracy Now! To see the whole evening's events, including clips of Democracy Now! Over the last 20 years, go to democracynow.org.